Namaskar. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the organizing committee, I warmly welcome you all to this webinar on comparative world literatures, focusing on the theme queer engagement in world literature. This is a subject of immense contemporary significance as it broadens our perspectives on literature, inclusivity, and cultural dialogue. It gives me immense honor to welcome our respected Vice Chancellor, Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am. Owing to pressing official commitments, ma'am could not join us live today. But her encouragement and blessings are always with us. She has kindly shared a video message for this webinar, which we will play shortly. But before that, I would like to give an introduction of Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am. Professor Nandini Sahu is a distinguished voice in contemporary Indian English literature and an Amazon best-selling author. She holds a doctorate in English literature under the guidance of the late Professor Niranjan Mohanty from Vishwabharati Shanti Niketan. Her academic and literary contributions span across India, the USA, the UK, Africa, Italy, Australia, and Pakistan. She is a triple gold medalist in English literature, recipient of the gold medal from the Honorable Vice President of India for her contribution to English studies, the prestigious Michael Madhusudan Academy Award 2024. Lifetime Achievement Award and the Tagore Samman 2025, Mukra Radha, among many others, with over 23 published books, including The Other Voice, Recollection as Redemption, Silver Poems on My Lips, and Sita. She has enriched Indian and world literature in profound ways. Her areas of research cover Indian literature, indigenous knowledge system, American literature, folk and children literature, and critical theory. She is also the editor of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Literature and Language. I also extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, Professor Raj Rao sir, welcome sir, an eminent figure in queer studies and literature in India, and Professor Kuhu Sharma Chanana ma'am, whose scholarship in gender, culture, and literary studies continues to inspire and guide students and researchers alike. Finally, I welcome the participants, faculty, research scholars, and students who have joined us. Your engagement will make today's deliberations meaningful and fruitful. With these words, I once again welcome everyone, and now I would request Rajda, who is managing the technical proceedings, to kindly play the video message of our respected Vice Chancellor, Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am. Rajda, please play the video. Raj Bhaiya, video.
Namaskar. I am Professor Nandini Sahu, Vice Chancellor, Hindi University, West Bengal. This particular program on comparative world literatures vis-a-vis the queer perspectives, it's something that we have been waiting for. Two established scholars of queer studies, Professor Raj Rao and Professor Kuhu Chanana, Kuhu Sharma. Both of them are going to talk to us today about the varieties of texts and the theoretical frameworks related to queer studies in various parts of the world, vis-a-vis world literatures, vis-a-vis comparative world literatures. Many congratulations to Dr. Madhumita, who has a PhD in queer studies, for coordinating this particular lecture on queer studies today. About my association with both the experts today, Professor Kuhu Sharma, I know her since decades. We met at Shimla for an international seminar on queer studies, and I was rather very influenced and very happy to attend her session. She conducted her session with a lot of confidence, and the interesting and the important research that she has been doing on queer studies was something that influenced me. And since then, there has been no looking back. We have been great friends. She's a wonderful human being, very compassionate, very kind. I have seen her going out of the way and helping the needy, the students, the scholars, and she's a very, very warm person. Everyone knows her. She's a very popular person as well. So my warm welcome to Professor Kuhu Sharma from Delhi University. The formal introduction will definitely be given by Dr. Madhumita. And the other scholar, Professor Raj Rao, he is an established writer, critic, theorist, and a scholar on queer studies. Whenever anyone in the country talks about queer studies, Professor Raj Rao's name will automatically come. There is no one, no researcher in queer studies who has no exposure to the work and the contributions done by Professor Raj Rao. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I'm sure that your intervention and your research, they are going to be very helpful for Dr. Madhumita and entire faculty and staff of students of Hindi University. About this Hindi University Special Lecture Series, let me just put it on record here that it's creating ripples. We have invited many scholars across the disciplines, across the states, and even some other countries. They have contributed in a big way. They have delivered their lectures, and today's lectures by both of you are definitely going to enrich the entire series. And in this particular series, 2 lectures today, we have a few expectations. Dr. Madhumita will discuss that in detail, but I would like to point out a few things that we expect from the 2 eminent scholars today. Through queer studies, we challenge the heteronormative universe in world literature, like foregrounding the plural and embodied ways of reading of queer studies, and how in our literatures, in our comparative world literatures, queer studies have come up as a counter canon formation. Queer perspectives open comparative literatures beyond the dominant Eurocentric and hetero-patriarchal canons, and we have become more flexible and more inclusive through queer studies in our literatures today, in the Bhasha literatures in India, in Indian writing in English, and also in the world literatures. Through queer studies, we are kind of translating desire, if I may say so. Comparative frameworks expose how non-heteronormative desires are translated, erased, or exoticized across the cultures. We have many such questions in our mind, which we would like the 2 experts, Professor Kuhu and Professor Raj Rao, to address for us. Then let's talk about the cross-cultural erotics through this lecture. Queer studies highlights how intimacy, kinship, and eroticism, they shift their meanings when compared across languages and geographies. There are temporal disruptions in the research vis-a-vis queer studies. Queer readings, they destabilize the linear progressivist histories of literature, introducing non-linear, cyclical, and queer temporalities. Probably we are going to address these issues today. And then through queer studies, we are doing some sort of embodied reading practices. Queer criticism insists on reading texts through the lived bodies, through body politics, through corporeality. Non-abstract universals aligning with decolonial comparative approaches are also things that we discuss in queer research. Then also we have to think about the heterosectional comparisons vis-a-vis queer literatures. Queer studies demands comparative attention to caste, race, class, gender, and indigeneity alongside sexuality. Queer studies is not just and not only about sexuality of people. We are addressing a whole lot of things. Professor Kuhu will be able to talk to you about regional literatures where queer studies have come up in a big way. And then I think Professor Rajrao may give us some ideas on the global South re-inscriptions vis-a-vis queer studies. Non-Western queer literatures resist being reduced to the Western categories, complicating the world in the world literatures. And then queer studies thinks about the politics of visibility. Comparative queer studies critique how visibility is granted or denied to the queer narratives in translation, circulation, and canonization. Also, there are things like the ethics of relationships. Queer comparative readings privilege the fluid, non-hierarchical relations between texts, traditions, and bodies. So these are some of the very complex issues that we, the common readers and researchers of queer literatures, queer studies, keep on thinking about. So today's lectures, both the lectures, probably are going to address all the questions that we have in our mind, or all the theoretical frameworks that the teachers of queer studies may take up in the classrooms, and all the creative writers may consider while writing a queer text. Somebody asked me, "Ma'am, what is a queer text?" I answered to the student in very many ways, which I am not going to discuss here. At the end of the lecture, probably, we will be in a position to take up those issues. With gratitude and a lot of happiness, I welcome Professor Kuhu and Professor Raj Rao to be a part of our Hindi University special lecture series on comparative world literatures. Welcome, thank you, and namaskar.
Okay. We are
Right.
deeply grateful to our respected Vice Chancellor, Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am, for sharing her encouraging words through this message. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, it is my privilege to introduce and invite our first speaker, Professor R. Raj Rao, sir. Namaskar, sir. Professor Raj Rao, sir, is one of the India's foremost voices in queer literature and studies. He obtained his PhD in English from the University of Bombay and has been associated with prestigious institutions worldwide, including the University of Warwick, the University of Iowa, Concordia University in Canada, and Tübingen University in Germany. He is the author of several acclaimed works of poetry, fiction, drama, and non-fiction. His path-breaking novel, The Boyfriend, is considered a landmark in Indian queer writing and has been translated internationally. His non-fiction book, Criminal Love, Theory and Praxis of Queerness in India, won the Likho Book Award for Excellence in Media also. Professor Rao has been invited to deliver lectures and reading across the world, from London and New York to Tokyo and Barcelona, and his works have been discussed in numerous scholarly books. He also served as professor and head of the Department of English at Savitribai Phule Pune University, where he taught creative writing, queer studies, and Indian writing in English for nearly 3 decades. We are honored to have him with us today. And now, I invite Professor Raj Rao, sir, to deliver his talk. Please welcome, sir, Professor Raj Rao, sir.
Thank you, and I'm sorry about the technical
There
part.
is no It's okay,
So
sir. There is no problem. Welcome, sir.
this usually happens, and that's why I don't like online talks, but can't be helped. Right. The title you gave me, I'm just sticking with that title. The title you gave me was Queer Engagement in World Literature. That's a broad area, um, and I will be talking about literature. The focus will be on literature. But before that, the terms LGBTQIA plus, there's a plus sign also, need to be explained because I cannot assume that everybody knows these terms or everyone's familiar with these terms. The LGBTQIA, L stands for lesbian. Lesbian is, women who are sexually attracted to other women are called lesbians. G is gay. Um, Men and women who are sexually attracted to people of their own sex and own gender are called gay. Um, Gay is a gender neutral term. A woman can also be called gay, and a man can be called gay as well. Whereas lesbian is a gender specific term. A man cannot be called a lesbian. B is bisexual, and that would refer to that would indicate people who are sexually attracted to all genders or both genders. After that, there is T, which is transgender. Transgender people are those who um, suffer a sort of conflict between their um, biological genders assigned to them at birth and their perceived gender of themselves as they grow up. And in short, transgender people have this feeling that they are in the wrong body. Q stands for queer, and of all these terms, I would say that it's the most political because it has to do with normativity, not just in the sexual sense, but in a broader sense. And it really is about decentering or destabilizing normativity. It can be called anti-normative. That is what Q stands for. It's the most political of these terms. Then you have I, which is intersex. Intersex is different from transgender because transgender people, there's no contradiction in their bodies at the time of birth. That is to say, they are either full-fledged males or females, full-fledged males with a penis and testicles, or full-fledged females with a vagina. But with intersex people, that is not the case, and there could be ambiguous genitals belonging to both genders, male and female, and these stay with them for life. Um, in recent literature, Arundhati Roy's novel Ministry of Utmost Happiness is a good example of an intersex character um, that really belongs to no particular gender. This child, when it's born, the mother thinks that it's a boy, it's a male child because it has a penis, but later on discovers that it also has a vagina. And this duality stays with the child as it grows up. Finally, there's A, which is asexual, which, there are people who say that they're not sexually attracted to any gender, and that can broadly be called asexual. Um, there is a plus sign, there are newer sexualities emerging, such as androsexual, gynosexual, uh, homosexual, and so on. We needn't worry about those terms at this point, but they are there in the formulation. So today, yeah, at one time we just said LGBT, and it ended as that. But today it's much wider, so it's necessary to say LGBTQIA, and even possibly put a plus sign. That's the correct way of doing it. Now, we use the word queer uh, a bit loosely, I would say, because true, it's an umbrella term, and it refers to people in general who are not attracted to the opposite sex, but who are attracted to their own sex, and it can be used in that sense. But it must be remembered that, as I was saying earlier, queer is also a political term. It's a political term that stands for anti-normativity. Normativity itself is a word that comes from, if you take the variations of the word normative, you get normativity. On the other side, you get norm, you get normal. So these are variations of the same word. And when you say anti-normativity, of course, it means that one is not normative. Now, normative is not exactly the same as normal, but they are related concepts. And that is why it's important to remember that it is a political term. And it's also important to remember when we are discussing a topic like this that the personal is always political. So one can't make that artificial distinction between the personal and the political, which was made in the past, in the 19th century. Um, you know, so people would say, why, why bring your personal life into it? That is no longer an argument that one can use, whether it's about sexuality or it's about one's other identities. Identities comprise of race and gender and caste and class and religion. All these things make up our identity. But to make an artificial distinction between what is personal and what is not personal is no longer what we do today. So there is an overlap between the personal and the political. Now, when you say queer literature, what does that mean? Queer literature is a representation of queerness in literature. So the key word here is representation, right? There's a difference between the real and the represented. So in the real world, of course, people are queer and live queer lives, either openly or secretly. They lead queer lives. But when we talk about queer literature, it is really about the representation of it, or the imagined aspect of queerness is what queer literature would mean. And for the purposes of my argument, literature here, I would define literature as poetry, fiction, plays. One can also add non-fiction. The traditional definition of literature, which is creative writing, is poetry, fiction, and plays, and we can stick with that. So, if you look at the history of queer representation in literature, it dates back to even the 19th century. Walt Whitman, for example, has poems which explicitly talk about homosexual love. And then in America, there have been others. In the 20th century, there was Allen Ginsberg, the Beat Generation poet. There was Alice Walker, um, the black African American poet and novelist. In England, England has famous examples, from Oscar Wilde to W.H. Auden, to E.M. Foster, to Christopher Isherwood. And then we come to our part of the world, Sri Lanka. There is Sham Selvadurai, who lives in Canada. Um, in the Caribbean, there's Shani Mutu. And in India, there are a lot of us, including me. There's Mahesh Dattani, there's Vikram Seth, there's Hoshain Merchant, there's Amrita Patil, there's Sachin Kundalkar. So, and it's not just restricted to English. Sachin Kundalkar, for example, writes in Marathi. So queer representation has always been there. We are talking about literature, but queer representation also exists in cinema, in theatre. Mahesh Dattani in India, for example, is a playwright. You know, so his work um, concerns drama. Now, here is a sort of ticklish question, and that is that in countries where queerness is still illegal, and it would be of interest to you guys to know that most countries in the world still criminalize same sex love, love between or sex between two people of the same gender. And India was no exception till the year 2018 when the Supreme Court read down a law that existed since the 19th century, 1860, when Lord Macaulay authored the Indian Penal Code, and Section 377 of the IPC, the Indian Penal Code, um, was about what it called unnatural sex between, you know, and actually unnatural sex itself can be defined in different ways. So it's not just sex between two people of the same gender. It talks about sex between um, human beings and animals, and it also uh, suggests that any sex that is non-procreative, that doesn't lead to pregnancy and childbirth of the woman, is also unnatural. Which would mean that a man and a woman can also have unnatural sex if it's not sex that leads to the birth of children. So that existed till 2018, till the Supreme Court finally read it down. Um, my point, the point I was making was that is the representation of queer literature also illegal? And I can tell you that there is no fixed answer to this question. There are people who believe that the law has to do with real queerness. That is to say, if two people of the same gender are having sex and they are found out, then the law would apply to them. But if you write about it, then the law does not apply to you. But I think that that's a sort of oversimplified view, because there have been cases where authors have got into trouble. The most famous instance is that of Oscar Wilde towards the end of the 19th century in England when he was put in jail. And here in India, in the 1940s, there was Ismat Chugtai, who wrote this novel in Urdu called Liha, translated into English as The Quilt. And she was also booked for obscenity because Liha tells a very lesbian story, you know, and she was booked for obscenity. Of course, she was acquitted because the court in Lahore found that there was not enough evidence to, to convict her on charges of obscenity. So one can't be sure that the representation of queerness cannot get one into trouble, which is what some people believe, that cinema and literature and theater are different from real queerness in the real world. In my own case, I have never got into trouble, but there's always the fear that someone can take exception, and more so now. How at the drop of a hat, uh, people are people are arrested. There is something called self-censorship. In the August 15 issue of Esquire magazine, they asked some of us writers what freedom meant to us. And when they asked me that, that appears in the August issue of Esquire, you can check it out. And I said that one of the things it means to me personally is that I shouldn't um, resort to self censorship. But increasingly, I find myself resorting to self censorship in that today, if I want to write something, I'm a little worried. I've all through my life, I mean, I've taken risks. Kuhu Chanana knows my work. She's written extensively on my work. And I've taken risks. And nothing has happened. But now, one is scared whether one can continue doing what one did, or someone can, there's a lot of rabble rousing that goes on. Someone can say that this is objectionable and needlessly, it causes needless harassment. So that's the question, that queer representation is not as if it cannot come under the purview of the law. Um, in India now, I'll give you another example. There's no Section 377 has been read down, and yet um, filmmaker O'Neill, his most famous film is My Brother Nikhil, but he wanted to make a film called VR, which is on the life of an army major. His name is J. Suresh, who came out as gay and who felt that he couldn't continue in the army as a gay man. Now, O'Neill wanted to make a sort of biopic on the life of this army major, and the idea was cleared by the censor board because films have to go through the Central Board of Film Censors, that is the CBFC. But at the last minute, the defense ministry stepped in and told him that he couldn't make the film. And I don't know whether they specified the reasons, but what was implied was that you cannot show anyone in the army as being gay, right? So he wasn't allowed to make the film. A lot of us wrote about it. I wrote a piece about it, which is now there in the new edition of my book, Criminal Love, Theory and Praxis of Queerness in India, published by Routledge. So that article appears in the last chapter of the book. So this means that, even representation can get one into trouble. Either you're not allowed to say or write or make the film that you want to, or if you do, then you can get into trouble, you know? Right. Let me move to the next point. I hope we have some time for a discussion if anybody has any questions to ask or
Yes,
comments to.
yes,
Uh,
definitely.
Now, my next point is that one has to see queer literature in a broad sense and not just literature that is concerned with the representation of queerness. Indeed, queerness itself has to be viewed in a broader way. And what I'm trying to say over here is that we need to see similarities between queer literature and other marginal literatures. And there are a whole range of marginal literature, from black literature, that is African American writing, there's Dalit literature in India, there's women's writing, and all these, Why do we call them marginal? We call them marginal because they are written by people who are marginalized, right? Like the black race is marginalized, Dalits and tribal people are marginalized, women are marginalized, and so are LGBT people, LGBTQ persons marginalized. And therefore, the literature that we produce is marginal literature that stands in opposition to what one might call mainstream literature. Now, that again is very vague because what is mainstream literature? you know, is really hard to put your finger on. However, there is that binary or that dichotomy that one can create between the mainstream and the margins. And as far as marginal literature, as far as literature is concerned, this is important. You know, um, this business of dichotomizing mainstream and marginal literature. Now, there are two things over here. Um, when you talk about similarities between all the different marginal literatures, we are automatically talking about something called intersectionality. And that is, really about the fact that I may be queer, but then, I have other identities as well, isn't it? I have a gender identity. I have a caste and class identity. I have a racial identity. And intersectionality would require that I see all these identities in total and not just narrowly look at only my queer identity. And then overall, see where I am empowered and where I am not empowered, right? So if there's a queer man, as in my case, then of course I am disempowered as far as sexuality is concerned. But since I'm a man, and I mean man in the social sense, because gender is a social construct. So I'm not saying male, but I'm saying man. I'm empowered as a man. So does my disempowerment as a gay or queer individual, um, is it offset or is it neutralized by my empowerment as a man, right? And then one can bring in other identity markers such as caste and class and even religion and see where you belong. In Alice Walker's novel Color Purple, which I teach in the American Literature course at Symbiosis College, you have a character, the central character, Celie, who is black and she's a woman and she's also, she's lesbian, although she's married to men against her wishes and raped and, has children by them and so on. But the way the plot is constructed, it becomes clear that her real preference is for women. And, which would mean that she's trebly at a disadvantage in terms of race, in terms of gender, as well as in terms of sexuality. So once you look at it in that way, you're automatically being intersectional. And I think that it's important. I have said elsewhere that, identities subsume each other, and that some identities tend to be um, more dominant than, I'm talking about marginal identities. I'm not concerned with the mainstream. Um, and incidentally, if you say mainstream, I don't know what's mainstream because the absolute mainstream would be the white heterosexual male who is empowered in terms of everything. The moment you move away from the white heterosexual male, and we in English departments, Kuhu will agree with me, throughout we've been teaching the work of only white heterosexual men. Um, if you look at the syllabi of English departments, it's only now that a change is beginning to take place, but otherwise it's always been white heterosexual men whose work we teach. So that is maybe the absolute mainstream. What I'm trying to say is that the mainstream is a very sort of it's a very ambivalent concept. But even among marginal identities, some tend to be more dominant than others and subsume others. And in that sense, I think queer identities suffer because everywhere, one of the first things that is said is that, oh, queer people are a minority compared to other identities. If you say race, then a large number of people are non-white, people of color. And if you say gender, women comprise nearly half the world population. So numerically, you can't even call them a minority. And likewise with caste and with class. But with sexuality, it's always said, and why this is said? This is said because the number of out queer people is always small. There are statistics that indicate, if you take India for example, when Riyad Baudia made Bombay based on my films, he had these intertitles. And in one of the intertitles, this was his statistic that 50% of Indian men have had a same sex experience with other men. 50%, that's half the population, right? But we still call ourselves a minority. Now, the reason for it is that, you know, it's only those who have come out of the closet and have declared that they are LGBT and so on, who would make up the statistic. A large number of people who are gay or lesbian or even transgender remain closeted. They don't come out. They lead double lives. And the reason for it is that, they're afraid of being shamed and ostracized and shaming their families and so forth. And so they remain closeted and therefore they don't become a part of the statistic. In the Supreme Court, actually, just to go into a little bit of the legal history, the Supreme Court finally decriminalized Section 377 in September 2018. This is September, so it was exactly 7 years ago. But long before that, in 2009, the Delhi High Court had similarly decriminalized Section 377. But since it was a High Court judgment and not a Supreme Court judgment, it was appealed against in the Supreme Court. And in December 2013, the Supreme Court recriminalized Section 377, right? So 2009 and then 2013 and then 2018, you see that it's been a very, very turbulent sort of journey from decriminalizing to recriminalizing and decriminalizing it again. Um, Now, at that time, the point I was making was that at that time, in 2013, when the Supreme Court recriminalized 377, one of the arguments in the judgment was that there are very few people, the judges use the term minuscule, they spelt it wrongly as minuscule, minuscule. And their argument was that if something like queerness affects only a minuscule amount of people, then why do we have to change the law just for this small percentage of people? You know, it was exactly the point that Justice A.P. Shah, who authored the 2009 judgment, was making. That he made a distinction between what he called public morality and constitutional morality. And constitutional morality is about giving fundamental rights to people, even if they are in a minority. So you can't, it's not as if only the majority have rights and the minority don't have rights. That was his argument. And eventually, of course, the Supreme Court had to return to that way of thinking in 2018. So the point I was making is that the reason why seeing queerness in isolation is a little undesirable, though I have elsewhere argued that it's about time we do that, precisely this reason. There's a lot of subsumption, right? So, this you see this in academic courses. Wherever I have gone, I have always found that gender and sexuality courses are clubbed together. I don't know how it is in your university, but it's always called gender and sexuality. Maybe now that's changing in some places, but on the whole, they are clubbed together, and then gender gets disproportionate attention. So 70-80% of the course tends to be on gender studies. And then 20%, a sort of tokenism, is relegated to queer studies. And so that was my argument that, you need a full-fledged queer studies course. And for that to happen, we need to look at queerness as an autonomous identity category. This view of mine has been discussed in various books in India and even outside India. Um, and there are people who agree and there are people who wouldn't agree because mine is, of course, a radical approach. But what I'm trying to say over here is that, in spite of what I have said, you know, it is. I also realize that intersectionality is important, and unless we are able to, because we all have multiple identities, we do have dominant identities, and but then they're not our only identities, and we need to see it in a broader way. So this connection with other marginal literatures. And the other thing I want to say in this context is that I find that even among other marginal identity categories, queerness gets a sort of step-brotherly treatment. Um, for example, if you take uh, if you take Dalit politics in India, you know, I know of a number of Dalit people who would say that queerness is not it's not relevant to us. In short, they would say there are no Dalits who are gay. So why should we extend a hand of friendship, let's say, to queer people? The gender lobby has also said similar things. You know, there are people who say that there are women in the women's movement who completely are not willing to recognize transgender identities or argue that trans women are not women because they're not born female and therefore they are not women. So J.K. Rowling, for example, author of Harry Potter, has famously held this view that trans women are not real women. And I know that in the women's movement, there are a number of women in the mainstream. So there are mainstreams within mainstreams, but in the mainstream feminist movement, there are women who believe that who don't want lesbianism to be clubbed with feminism. Although there's something called lesbian feminism, and Adrian Rich's famous essay, compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence, is really talking about a lesbian continuum, which is not just about lesbian sexuality, but it's about women coming together, political lesbianism, if you like. But that is not easily understood. In 1998, when Deepa Mehta made the film Fire, and the Hindu far right, Shiv Sena and other political outfits wanted to ban the film because it dealt with lesbianism, not just lesbianism, but lesbianism within a middle class household in Delhi. Um, so women went in Delhi itself. There was these protest marches that women took out, and they went with banners and so on. But when lesbian groups tried to join the protest, they were sort of cold shouldered. They were accused of hijacking the protest. And it was the same argument, that first of all, Fire is not a lesbian film per se, because both the women, they are sisters in law, and they are married, and they turn to each other only because they are neglected by their husbands, and this is nothing but situational lesbianism, and all these sort of specious arguments were put forth at the time. And if you read Ashwini Suptankar's anthology, Facing the Mirror, which came out in 1998, it opens with a note exactly about this, that when lesbian groups tried to join the protests against banning the film Fire, instead of welcoming them, the mainstream women's groups just sort of cold shouldered them and told them that this was, that they had no right to be there. So on. Now, my next point is about aesthetics. Since we are talking about literature, literature needs to be evaluated. How do you decide whether a work of literature, whether a novel or a poem or a play, is good or not good? However unsatisfactory the terms good and bad are, but when you evaluate something, you have to, right? You have to say whether it's good or bad or mediocre or whatever. Now, how do you do this? You do this by applying literary critical principles, established literary critical principles to the work in front of you, the queer work in front of you. Now, this is again problematic. You know why? Because if you apply established literary critical principles, which have been handed down to us from a long time. I mean, in India, you had Sanskrit poetics and aesthetics, but most of our literary criticism, at least as far as English departments are concerned, comes from the West, isn't it? So you have, you have a number of well-known critics, A.C. Bradley and R.A. Richards, and T.S. Eliot was also a critic, and and several others. Now, if you evaluate queer literature with the aid of these mainstream literary critical principles, you're going to come to the conclusion that this is not literature, that this is propaganda, that when you use a term like queer literature, your emphasis is on the word queer and not on the word literature, meaning that, literature is made up of poetry and plays and fiction. But what you have produced is not really poetry or fiction or drama, but it's just propaganda. This is a harsh view, but it's there. It has been said. So this is one of the things that will be said if you use mainstream literary critical principles to evaluate queer literature. The second thing that will be said is that queer literature is pornography, right? Why? You know what's pornography, right? And it's called pornography because there's too many explicit descriptions of sex, and therefore it's not literature, but it's pornography because literature has to be decorous, the language has to be decorous, right, and refined and sublime, and you can use all these adjectives. And queer literature is not like that. And it's true, if you look at queer literature from anywhere in the world, it is sexually explicit. It has to be because the constituency itself is sex. Just as in the case of black literature, the constituency is race, or in the case of Dalit literature, the constituency is caste. In the case of women's literature, it's gender. So here it is sex and sexuality. So obviously, you can't shy away from um, fairly detailed descriptions of sexual activity. This is why Ismail Chukta, the story of Liaf is that it actually comes from an supposedly from an injunction in Islam, which says that I don't know whether this is true, but this is what I've read. Um, Salim Kidwai is the late Salim Kidwai. I blindly go by what he says about Islamic injunctions. In fact, I wouldn't have written my novel Mahmud and Ayaz. Please buy it. It's published by Speaking Tiger last year. If I hadn't heard about the love story of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni and his Turkish slave lover Ayaz from Salim Kidwai, in his book which he co-authored with um, Ruth Vanita. That is what gave me the idea to write the novel Mahmud and Ayaz. In fact, I wanted him to write an endorsement, and he agreed. And it was so sad that just before the book came out, he passed away. So it goes without his endorsement. But so what I was saying is that as far as Lihaf is concerned, apparently there's this injunction in the Quran that two people of the same gender shouldn't sleep under the same quilt. And that's exactly what this woman and her maidservant do. The woman sleeps with her maidservant. She's neglected by her own husband, who's interested more in men than in women. And then you have a little child over there who comes and in the last scene sort of pulls off the quilt, and we're not told what he sees. It's left to our imagination. But that was enough for people to say that the novel was obscene, you know. So gay writing, has to be that this is nothing, what Chuptai does in Lihaf. It has to be sexually explicit. You can't, in fact, let me be a little self-referential here. Alka Angeria, um, she's been very supportive of my work, like Kuhu. And she wrote a review or an article somewhere, where she compares my sex scenes in Boyfriend and other novels with those of, say, writers like Amitabh Ghosh. And she says that mine work better only because I'm more direct, whereas others, she mentioned Amitabh Ghosh, could be many others, they sort of, I wouldn't say beat around the bush, but they try to talk about sex and sexual activity and sexual intercourse in a more um, indirect way, which, from their point of view, is a more refined way of doing it. Because if you're too direct, then it becomes unrefined, it's crude, and all that. But this is where queer aesthetics are required, because you have to have a different set of literary critical principles to evaluate marginal literature. The Dalits have understood this, and Black American and British writers have understood this. You know, if you look at Black writing, Langston Hughes and Maya Angelou and so on, they, they don't do what T.S. Eliot thinks of as a good poem. They use the rhythms of jazz and blues music and rap and so on. There's no economy there. even the beat generation poets. I mean, Eliot and Pound, Ezra Pound. For them, poetry, apart from other things, I'll talk about other things as well. That Eliot is notorious, but a poem had to have economy. When poets showed their work to Ezra Pound, he always felt that there were too many words in a poetic line. And his advice to them was to squeeze out every excess word. Squeeze out, like you squeeze out toothpaste from a tube. Um, Now, when you're using the rhythms of jazz and blues and rap and so forth, you can't do that. And you don't do that. You don't do that on purpose. This is what you learn from African American writers like Maya Angelou and even Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and a whole lot of them. Likewise with Dalit writing in India. My friend Sharan Kumar Limbale has a whole book on Dalit aesthetics. Because again, what happens globally happens in India also, where the high caste Savarna critics have always been very critical about Dalit writing and said that, oh, it's too autobiographical, there's too much anger, there's too much emotion. And this is where we return to good old T.S. Eliot again, because he famously said that poetry is an escape from emotion, not a turning loose of emotion. But you can't apply that to Dalits. How dare you tell them that you don't express emotion because they've been through so much? And you can't say that to LGBT people as well, because even we've been through so much. We've been ostracized, there's been a law against us, there have been conversion therapies, there have been honor killings, there have been all that, and then we are told that, don't express emotion, but escape from it and try to be as restrained as you can. And this is a white heterosexual male telling us this, and why the hell should we go by, what they say? So, did you get my point that evolving your own literary criteria to do justice to queer literature and other marginal literatures is important, because unless you do it, the work is not doing justice to the work. You know, all marginal literature in that sense, will just be sort of regarded as inferior, second-rate literature, right? And also this charge of I'm nearly done, and I will open it to discussion. But also this charge that it's 1 hour, right, since we started. I'm nearly done. This charge that marginal literatures tend to be too sort of self-referential, autobiographical. You're only talking about yourselves, which means that you don't have an imagination. With authors like Salman Rushdie and Marquez and so on, uh, their kind of writing is called magical realism, and there's a lot of invention and imagination at work over there, right? By contrast, if a work is autobiographical, then of course you're cashing in too much on your own life and not imagining enough. But there's a way of responding to that, and the response would be that when there's already so much of drama and conflict in our own lives, where is the need to imagine conflict? What happens in magical realism is that conflict is imagined, but it's imagined. This is, you can look at it, you can argue against it in this way, that it's imagined only because the authors themselves have not had any conflict in their own lives. They are leading secure, privileged lives, and there's no conflict. So you imagine conflict, but there is already conflict in my life as a tribal, as a Dalit, as a black person, as an LGBT person, right? Um, of course, I want to share that with the rest of the world and let them know what we've been through, right? So it's bound to be autobiographical. And therefore, to say that, one of the things that the Savarna critics have said against Dalit writing, the most important Dalit writing comes from Maharashtra. There is Dalit writing in other states as well, but the first Dalit anthology was from here. Now, that's, I think, easily understandable because Ambedkar himself was from Maharashtra, you know. And when um, this work came out, either in the original Marathi or in English translations, the high caste Savarna critics were very sort of dismissive. And one of the things that they said was that, you know, you may call it a poem, you may call it a short story, you may call it a play, but at the end of the day, it's nothing but autobiography. In other words, you don't even know what the forms or the genres of literature are, you know. For you, everything is autobiographical. The only thing you know is to wallow in self pity. If you read Limbalé's Outcast, the Marathi original is called Akarmashi, I teach it. And it's kind of, from except at the end, where there's a little bit of liberation. But otherwise, it's completely about um, sorrow. It's a very hard life. It's a life of unrelieved pain and suffering. And so they would say that, you know, where is it, would you call this literature? This is a question. It's like Mary Antoinette saying, if there's no bread, let them eat cake. What it means is that you're so cut off from reality that if you lead secure and privileged lives, you think that everybody leads secure and privileged lives, which is not the case. And certainly not the case with marginal people, you know, who incidentally the mainstream are responsible for marginalizing. The last thing I'll say is that in 2023, after the 2018 victory, some LGBT people, not all, because not all of us believe in same sex marriage. I don't, for example. But some of us wanted that the court should now legalize same sex marriage, right? And see marriage as a fundamental right, which heterosexuals have. But that case was lost. The Supreme Court didn't agree to it, you know. So it means that same sex activity is legal, but same sex marriage isn't. And look at the contradiction there, see, because it's the same people. And it's not just the court was really reflecting public opinion. Because I know it for a fact, there were surveys conducted that, again, the Savarnas and Orthodox high caste people were opposed to same sex marriage. I heard from friends of mine that in some cities, they even took out morsas, processions, saying that no, we can't do this, it's against Indian culture, so the court shouldn't legalize same sex marriage. This actually happened, right? Now, it's those very people who point fingers at the LGBT community and say that you guys are incapable of, you guys are promiscuous. Especially gay men have been accused of promiscuity. And we're also blamed for AIDS, right? AIDS has been a very serious issue in India. A lot of people have died of AIDS, and because the majority of homosexual men also get married to women, right? Uh, then the women also get infected, and sometimes children are born with HIV. And so the argument was that you guys are responsible. You sleep around. You're promiscuous. You have what's called um, um, your what's the word? Okay, it'll come back. Uh, Polyamorous. You're that, and you're responsible for spreading AIDS. That's one, yeah, that's what we are told. But then at the same time, if we don't want that to happen, let us get married to our partners. So then, like with heterosexuals, once heterosexuals get married, seemingly they don't sleep around because then they have to be faithful to their spouses, right? Um, and so they don't sleep around. So if you let us get married to our partners, then maybe we will also stop being promiscuous. We stop being polyamorous, and we will be faithful to our partners. But you don't allow that too, right? So what is to be done? You don't allow us to get married to our partners. At the same time, you accuse us of having multiple partners. You can't have it both ways. You can't have your cake and eat it too. So I'll stop there. I hope I have given you what you're looking for. And so, Madhumita, you can take over and see if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, sir, Professor R. Raj Rao, sir, for your illuminating lecture on queer engagement in world literature. Your insights on how queer voices have shaped and redefined literary spaces across cultures were both thought provoking and inspiring. We truly appreciate the way you connected theory with lived experiences and literary practice, making this session meaningful for all of us. Your perspectives on queer literature and its place in world literature have enriched our understanding and given us much to reflect upon. We are truly grateful for your valuable contribution to this webinar. Thank you very much, sir. Now, it is my honor to introduce and welcome our second distinguished speaker, Professor Kuhu Sharma Chanana ma'am. Professor Chanana is an accomplished scholar and writer with four notable books to her credit, including T.H. Lawrence and the poetic novel An Evening Rainbow, Queer Writings in Bhasha Literatures, LGBTQ Identities in Select Modern Indian Literature, and deviant sexualities and artistic representations in contemporary India. Her contributions extend beyond books to numerous scholarly articles on feminism and alternative sexuality in Indian literature, published in reputed journals and series. She has also edited a special issue on same sex love fiction for Indian literature. Professor Chanana's academic excellence has been recognized through prestigious fellowships, including the Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship at Edinburgh University, the UGC Research Award Fellowship, and the Teen Murthy Fellowship. She is currently Professor of English Literature at SSN College, University of Delhi. We are honored to have her with us today. And now, I invite Professor Kuhu Sharma Chanana ma'am to deliver her lecture. Welcome, ma'am.
Before Kuhu starts, Kuhu, I want to
Ma'am, can
apologize.
you please unmute your... Yes, ma'am.
Can you
Yes,
hear me?
okay.
Yes, sir.
So, Kuhu, please forgive me, excuse me. I have a class at 2 o'clock.
Surely, sir.
So, and I know your work, and I'll catch it again on YouTube. But all the best. I won't be able to sit for your talk
Surely,
because
sir.
uh, it's at another place, and I have to drive through the traffic and reach there.
Surely,
So,
sir.
sorry about it, and we'll catch up. Okay.
Thank you, sir. It's an absolute honor to share the space with you, the creator of Immortal UD.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. A very good afternoon
Thank you
to
so
all
much,
of
sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
A very good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Nandini Sahu, Dr. Madhumita, and the organizers for giving me this wonderful opportunity to interact with audiences. As the title suggests, I will try to map the trajectory of contemporary Indian regional Kuwait literature. This talk is divided into 5 sections. The first section deals with the socio-cultural climate of the countries in 90s that led to not only spurt in Kuwait writings but also to landmark judgment. The second and third sections of this talk deal with the linkages between colonial rule and widespread homophobia and how the critical works by Ruth Vanita, Salim Kedwai, and Geeti Thedani showcase the very Indian character of homosexual desire in pre-colonial and ancient India by citing examples from the ancient texts and iconography. The later sections deal with the queer representation in contemporary regional literature. So, the last 2 decades have seen a sea change in India's visible sexuality profile and mark the weakening of the so called normative sexual identity categories. Several events and actions gave impetus to the flourishing ground for not only exposition of queer writings but also contributed towards the final judgment pertaining to the repeal of Section 377 and the passing of Transgender Protection Act in 2019. The events that have contributed towards it are primarily located in 90s, such as the organization yeah, such as the organization of a demonstration in 1992 by AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andolan against the public harassment of gay people. In 1993, an international seminar on AIDS was organized, focusing for the first time in India on the issue of homosexuality. In 1994, the Election Commission instructed that hijras or eunuchs should be on electoral rolls and be allowed to choose their gender. 1997 saw the furor over film Fire, which was of such magnitude that 14 years later, Shohini Ghosh wrote a book, Fire, a queer film classic published in 2011, to catalogue the implications of this film vis-a-vis the radical shift on the issue of lesbian visibility. In 1999, Kolkata held the Friendship Walk. The idea was adopted by queer people from other cities and evolved as the Pride March. In 2003, the People's Union for Civil Liberties (PUCL) published a report on human rights violation against transgender community. In 2009, the Delhi High Court read down Section 377, leading to the decriminalization of homosexuality and a consequent spurt in the filing of the nomination by the members of the Khijra community for parliamentary positions. In 2011, a Gurgaon court recognized the marriage between Beena and Savita, two women from Khekra village in Bagpur, that was published in Times of India, 29 July 2011. Thus, slowly and gradually, the atmosphere was ripe for the two landmark judgments, such as repeal of Section 377 and the implementation of Transgender Persons Protection Act. These two judgments have mitigated an atmosphere of fear and phobia surrounding articulation of queer identities that has all pervasive for so many years after the colonial invasion. In fact, various studies have proved that in colonial India, the marginalization of queer sexuality was a latent but a potent part of the political agenda of the colonizers is an established fact now. And it is important to understand the linkages between colonialism and homophobia before we proceed further. The effeminate Indian man was supposed deemed feeble enough to rule both the land and the women of the nation. Thus, homosexuality was catalogued as a specifically Oriental vice that can be annihilated only through colonial intervention and control. Anti colonial nationalism tried to mitigate this oppression by promoting heterosexual procreative sex, which has further redlined the alternative sexuality. Indubitably, the non acceptance of homosexuality is greatly linked with the colonial rule. Equally pertinent is to note the case of Richard Burton's missing Karachi report, as mentioned by Anjali Arnodkar in her seminal work For the Record on Sexuality and the Colonial Archive in India, published in 2010. What happens? Arnodkar gives a detailed analysis of it, that in and around 1845, an officer in British Army serving in India, Richard Burton, as he was the only one who could speak Sindhi, was authorized by General Charles Napier to form a report on the so-called vice of pederasty. To quote Arnodkar, to quote, one must remember here that the scandal of the Karachi report lies in the promise of its explosive contents, in its exposure of the most covert and unspeakable of activities, male to male sex, and moreover, English male and native male sex. Unquote. So the umpire's decision to not record it hugely signifies the imperious agenda of invisibilizing homosexuality. Such was the paranoia amidst the rulers regarding any effort to visualize homosexuality in colonial India, especially between white men and native men, Indian men, that the entire career of Richard Burton, both as an officer and as a writer, has been entrenched in a quagmire. As Arnotkar mentions in her book, that a major part of the manuscript was destroyed by the over-concerned relatives and numerous fires. Such was the opprobrium suffered by Burton that it resulted in self-censorship, because of which he has developed an extremely illegible handwriting which could only be understood by him. Similarly, in the introduction to her seminal work, Infinite Desires, Madhavi Menon, published in 2018, catalogues that before the colonial invasion, the Aryans, the Greeks, the Ghaznavis, the Mughals, the early Syrian Christians, the Parsis, the Americans, the Chinese, and the Arabs have found a flourishing ground in India to weave even their non-normative desires in the fluid porousness of sexual desires as prevalent in ancient India. In fact, famously, Kama, the god of sexual desire and love in Indian mythologies, is called Ananga, without any limbs, and therefore highly malleable, porous, and without any boundaries, and thus fluid in nature. Hence, the non acceptance of homosexuality is clearly linked with colonial rule, which forged a strong link between sexual identity and the then ongoing national struggle for freedom. Studies have shown that gender ideologies were a major route for legitimizing colonialism. In fact, in his book, The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, published in 1983, Ashish Nandi examines the homosexual criminalization of Oscar Wilde in the colonial context. It was necessary to show through the public punishment uh, of gay British men like Wilde that their feminine weaknesses would not be allowed to undermine the glorified British heterosexual masculinity. Using Pandey Bechan Sharma Ug's writing called Chocolate, published in 1927, which was originally written in Hindi and later translated in English, and the debates arising after its subsequent publications, Ruth Vanita examined the tendency to associate sexual identity with national character, which had to be necessarily heterosexual, monogamous, ultra-masculine, procreative identity, and how the gay representations in these stories called Chocolate were seen as projecting a derogatory and effeminate picture of Indian men to the British imperial past, and consequently becoming a setback to the national struggle for free independence. One can find a detailed depiction of it in Ruth's work, Chocolate and Other Stories. Hence, there is a constant tendency in public, private, cultural, political, and socio-academic environments to situate homosexual desire as a middle class Western import completely devoid of Indian roots. This in turn explains the writings of Ugra and Rajkamal Chaudhary, the author of Machli Mari Hui, first published in 1966 in Hindi and recently translated by Mahua Sen as Dead Fish in English, which are fraught with ambivalent homophobic anxiety. The broad-based protest against the movie Fire by Shiv Sena and attacks on cinema halls screening Deepa Mehta's film Fire further explains this. Little wonder the quaid writings even now inhabit just the margins of the Indian literary worlds, and the visibility of homoerotic literature at the Indian literary map is still a tantalizing dream. There can be two reasons for this. First, the Indian quaid writing is still at a nascent stage as compared to the Western writings. And second, in India, unlike the West, there are no separate departments of LGBTQ studies and alternative sexualities most of the universities. And in India, inevitably, there is a serious paucity of specific queer literary tradition in Indian writings. Indeed, it is of singular importance to explore queer articulations in Bhasha literature, shining a light on the all pervasive presence of homoeroticism across India, so that this should no longer be considered a fashionable prerogative of the English speaking upper class. Queer articulation in Bhasha literature, due to its unique Indian origin, clearly dismantles the assumption that same sex desire is the construct of English speaking upper class people who have access to a cosmopolitan life. This discourse also focuses on the areas that have been largely neglected in Indian queer studies, such as specific problems of biphobia, that is, of bisexuality, sexual citizenship, and queer geography or a queer spatial politics, as seen through the lens of regional queer literary writings. Keeping this in mind, the present discussion aims at bringing into focus the literary representations of same sex desire from regional Indian languages such as Uriya, Punjabi, Pashto, Hindi, Gujarati, and Marathi. These literary texts excavate issues of citizenship, animal turn in queer literature to homophobic anxieties, and specific opprobrium suffered by bisexuals and trans individuals. The special focus will be on the bisexuality and trans individuals because within the LGBTQI spectrum, they are one of the most marginalized entities. In this critical sphere, the two important works on regional queer literature, especially in the critical writing, is published. It's a book by Ruth Vanita entitled "On the Edge," and another one is written by me, "An Evening Rainbow." Let us first discuss the issue of sexual citizenship as evinced in Punjabi story by Sukirat entitled "Home." So let us first understand what we understand by the sexual citizenship. When it comes to claiming citizenship by queer individuals, Winnie and Brown, in their seminal work, Sexual Citizenship, has described three kinds of citizenship vis-a-vis queer, such as consumer citizenship, familial citizenship, and age citizenship. In this regard, Spivak considered property and adoption laws as a part of the heteronormative paradigm and supports getting a queer citizenship or the familial citizenship through gay marriage only as an individual choice and a means to destabilize normalcy, but certainly not a means to claim for familial citizenship of the nation, which has a heterosexual character. But on the other hand, there are critics like Ruth Vanita, who, in her essay, Democratizing Marriage, Consent, Custom, and the Law, takes a pro marriage stand through not only to justify the argument that the right should be available to people irrespective of their sexual orientation. This makes us rethink that the issue of individual right is perfectly justified, but the so-called radical mutation to measures like same-sex marriage, which is highly heterosexual in nature, can only happen at the periphery and will not be able to destabilize the center at all. Thus, this kind of sexual citizenship has been shown in a Punjabi story called The Home by Sukirat, which shows an alternative family structure where two gay people are there and they have a daughter called Kalyani. When the two queer people have a child and form this kind of alternative family structure, it of course creates radical ruptures in the idea of heterosexual family. So at that level, it is indeed progressive. But on the other hand, there are radical queer critics who say that by doing so, they are closing down to the ways or alternative ways of loving and living and succumbing to again a straight kind of a familial structure. So this kind of debatability, this is debatable in that sense. So this is a story which was written in Punjabi and later on translated into English. The very title of the story suggests home is the name. So the very title of the story suggests a stable family structure. In fact, it refers to a gay couple living together for more than a decade. Right from the opening, the story attempts to familiarize homosexuality by placing it within a very normal day-to-day household activity like any straight household, where one person is cooking and the other partner is checking mails and getting message from a so-called daughter to come home. It is a household of two gay men and one daughter named Kalyani. To quote from the text, I'm quoting from the story that how it starts. It is yet another morning unfolding into a day in his home. Manohar is in the kitchen preparing the morning breakfast. Sujit is on the computer scoring the emails that have arrived since the previous night. Besides various banal messages and few official ones, there is also a personal message. It reads, "Get ready to supper me once again. This is Kalyani, their daughter's favorite and much worn subject line for her emails." Whenever she comes to Mumbai, these are the words she always uses to announce her visit. And then Manohar said, "Your daughter is coming to Mumbai." Surjit tells Manohar, sipping his coffee by the small table that they have set in the kitchen itself. Unquote. This news immediately perks Manohar's ears, who has been slurping absent-mindedly from his cup of strong tea. Throughout the story is saturated with the description of the alternative familial structure, and there is a effort to normalize that. Uh, the retreat into a family space for claiming citizenship is indeed fraught with problems. For despite the fact that the vector of sexual citizenship blurs the boundaries of public and private spaces and might involve an intervention into a public sphere, what Weeks calls a moment of transgression, it is paradoxical position. Because, as Bell and Binney argue in their work, that the agitation of the legalization of lesbian and gay marriage restates family as a private site of citizenship. They affirm that, to quote, "incorrect sexual right claims, the struggle to define families we choose bear the mark of this privatization impulse, as the retreat into a family space is a necessary strategy for claiming citizen status. Sometimes that closes down ways of living and loving that don't accord with the model of family, no matter however it is expanded." Unquote. Yet another neglected area in queer studies and research in India is the addressing the biases and problems encountered by bisexuals. There is a severe dearth of quality research on biphobia, which is different from homophobia. The specific biases faced by bisexuals are generally subsumed under the ambit of queer studies, and they are considered outsider by both the straight people and by the queer people, because they feel that they are sleeping with the enemy, right? So in that way, bisexuality is a very, very problematic situation. Hence, bisexuals not only become the victim of heterosexual homophobia, but also come to be considered traitors by homosexuals. According to Robin Uch, the writer of Biphobia, it goes more than two ways. There's indeed not only an overlap between homophobia and biphobia, but also a distinct gap as well. She states, to quote, "Bisexuals who fit neither the prioritized category nor its perceived antithesis create discomfort and anxiety in others simply by the fact of their existence. There's pressure for those of us who do not fit to remain silent about our deviation, because there is a great deal at stake. Perpetuating the silence of bisexuals allows the dominant culture to exaggerate the differences between heterosexual and homosexual and to ignore the fact that human sexuality exists on a continuum. Thus, bisexuals suffer discrimination from homosexuals on account of their attendant privileges of being able to have heterosexual license and supposedly hide their same-sex desire uh, uh, under the garb of family structures and other heterosexual patterns. No wonder Cheryl Clark calls bisexuality a safer label. Thus, anxiety is explored in this kind of anxiety of bisexuality and issues surrounding them have been explored in three literary signatures. One is a step taken by, it's a short story by Iqbal, which was translated from Punjabi. Cobalt Blue, which is a novel by Sachin Kundelkar, translated from Marathi, and Wali Cha again, a story from Gujarati. They are these work primarily narrated from the point of view of their same-sex partners. These stories posit the question, is the exhibition of the ambivalent and debatable bisexuality in these stories an act of showcasing how certain correct characters succumb to the temptation of mainstream heterosexuality in order to gain its attendant privileges? Or it is a product of biphobia and misunderstanding of bisexual people's fluid sexuality? In the short story Steps Taken Back, which is again, I said, translated from Punjabi, the same sex lover feels cheated on account of the bisexuality of her same sex lover. For when bisexuality is viewed through the another very interesting aspect is in these stories, but that when their bisexuality is viewed from the lens of queer geography or queer spatial politics, it adds another twist to the tale. For bisexual spaces tend to blur the distinction between the straight and the gay spaces in a way. They are in between. But the question is whether they are able to create the much needed pansexual domains, which should ideally mitigate the straight binary opposition between the straight and the gay spaces or not. Quoting Hammings, Brown, Gavin Kath, and Jason Lim, uh, I argue that bisexuals may think of either gay or straight spaces both as home, but a bisexual identity is never predominant in either set of spaces. And although the presence of bisexuals may be acknowledged, it is seldom fully included. As the story steps taken by Iqbal Deep, the protagonist lives with her partner in an apparently perfect lesbian household with a servant. The partner of the protagonist develops a relationship with the servant, and the space turns from queer to straight. And the pain of the narrator is depicted quite poignantly, but nowhere the inherent bisexuality of her partner is accepted. For either one is expected to be straight or queer, and bisexuality is always hidden beneath these two identities. So the presentation of the exclusive bisexual space is still a myth, especially in Indian regional literary texts. Further complicating the situation, Gavin Kath and Jessim Lim, quoting her Hubert, state that, to quote, bisexual space is neither gay nor straight space, and presence of bisexual identities in a space is always partial. Another story which is significant in this aspect is a Hindi short story called Parchai, written by Shubhamam Negi, that takes a sympathetic view pertaining to biphobia and also throws light on the marginalization of straight women who have been married to gay men. By citing the example of the movie Utsav, the festival directed by Girish Karnad in 1984, Gayatri Gopinath in Impossible Desire, Queer Diaspora in South Asian Public Culture, published in 2005, talks about the coexistence of heterosexual and homosexual desires and creating a third space. To quote Gopinath, to quote, a queer reading might also allow for the possibility of
Ma'am, your video is muted now.
yeah,
Yeah.
might also allow for the possibility of triangulated desire that does not solidify into lesbian, queer, or heterosexual, but rather opens up a third space where both hetero and homoerotic relationship coexist simultaneously. In this regard, the story Valicha, which was translated from Gujarati by Bhupen Khakkar, is especially significant. For it beautifully presents that specific third space where a subtle negotiation rather than an antagonistic contestation between hetero and homosexual desires take place. Khakkar explained this in these words. I'm quoting from the story where the man, woman, where the two gay men and a woman, they all are present in the same room. To quote, I reluctantly went and sat. He cares my legs and kept discussing legal matters with the woman. I figured out that the woman needed some help, and Valicha was only too willing to do so. Then all of a sudden their topic changed. They started winking lecherously, fooling around, and cracking jokes. He rubbed my legs harder as they went along passionately. I felt an undercurrent of lust rising like fragrance in all three of us. Unquote. Thus, on account of the factors mentioned above, it is not a great surprise that it is difficult to find fully developed bisexual protagonists other than the one portrayed in Kundelkar's Cobalt Blue, translated from Marathi. This work exposes the convoluted layers of queer geography. The protagonist Tanay in this story comes as a paying guest in the middle class home. He has relationship with both the brother and the sister at the same time, and finally he runs away with the sister. Later, he abandons her and just vanishes. Again, employing queer spatial lens to the novel adds another traction to this work. Though Tanay's bisexuality operates within the confines of the normative household, but he has given an attic room or tower room, as he calls it, which in one way is situated outside the domain of heterosexual household and therefore occupies a liminal space just like in between sexuality. The attic room became a space for the two gay lovers to explore all dimensions of the homoerotic desire. To quote from the text, to quote, the mattress I had brought up, saying that I would study in the tower room, was never taken downstairs. I encroached on your space slowly, hoping not to be rebuffed at new each foray. Unquote. However, the idea of radicalizing the sexual household by placing bisexual desire within it gets slightly punctured as due to the position of the attic room. The articulation of bisexuality is inconspicuous to the prying eyes of the straight dwellers. This definitely, at one level, gives a safe refuge for the employment of alternative sexuality, but on the other hand, it also points towards a certain sort of invisibility. Yet another marginalized identity within the LGBTQIA spectrum is trans individuals. Now, I will talk about them. Despite their ancient and contemporary visibility at religious spaces and stories, such as Shikhandi Amba and the goddess of Bahucharji in North Gujarat, especially worshipped by Hijras as the goddess is associated with sex change, the miseries of these outcast identities are still unnoticed. One of the major reasons can be adduced to biphobia because the dual identity of men and women is so conspicuous within an individual in trans identity that it evokes a terrible anxiety. No doubt, it is a daunting task to find a literary representation of exclusive Hijra identity in Bhasha literature, and after much deliberation, one can discover only few literary texts that have Hijra protagonist. The text I will be discussing is Abdul Khalid Rashid's Adhura Insan or Incomplete Human, translated from Pashto, which poignantly highlights the issue of invisibility of Hijras who are nameless Hijra and the gory death rituals of Hijras, which symbolically represent the internalized transphobia of eunuchs. The story is remarkable for cataloging train as a heterotopic site for exploring and flowering of transgressive desires. It appears that train is not only an interesting site of intersection of private and public sphere, but also a fine example of Foucauldian heterotopias. According to Foucault, to quote, there are certain identities like adolescents, mensurating, and pregnant women who are in crisis with their environment. Foucault argues that boarding schools in 19th century form or military services for young men, the train, and the honeymoon hotels are all examples of heterotopias of crisis. Because first manifestations of sexual virility were in fact supposed to take place elsewhere than at home. For girls, there was until the middle of the 20th century a tradition called the honeymoon trip, which was an ancestral theme. The young woman's deflowering, the young woman yeah, the young woman's deflowering could take no pair, and at the moment of its occurrence, the train or honeymoon hotel was indeed the place of this nowhere. These heterotopias without geographical marker. Little wonder one of the most ostracized identity within queer academia and the obvious corporeal marker of liminal existent hijra, who's otherwise largely invisible in literary representation, expresses the pathetic and inhuman condition of his or her life inside a train compartment in Adhura Insan or Incomplete Human. After giving an analysis of gay and bisexual and transgender, let me briefly give the regional literary climate for lesbianism. Earliest representations such as Ekakni, written in 1947 and translated by Ruth Vaneta, translated from Hindi, is probably the first Hindi novel on lesbianism. The two however, it is somewhat fraught with lesbophobic anxiety, but it is not that conspicuous as in the works such as Rajkamal Chaudhary's Machli Mari Hui, written in 1967, or Shivani's Hindi short story Manik, written in Hindi, where the criminalization of lesbianism is shown when one of the lesbian partners kill the other one for money. In the similar fashion, the contributory fissures and lesbophobic anxiety is conspicuous in Hiranmay Mishra's The Tale of Rainy Night, translated from Uriya. However, there are two very progressive stories from Bhasha literature to works. One is a behind the scene by Sarojini Sahu, translated from Uriya, and Gitanjali Shri Purohit in Hindi. Both showcases lesbianism as an answer to oppressive heteropatriarchal structure and also talk about the lesbian motherhood. In fact, they give a reference to they bear a close semblance with the story of Bhagirathi, Bhagirathi's birth, which is depicted in the Bengali version of Ramayana, that is a Kriti Bhashi Ramayana, written in and around 15th century and popularized by Ruth Vanita. According to her, the most explicit case of the co-wives as partners and joint mothers is perhaps that of the King Dilipa's co-widows, wives of mother of Bhagirathi. They produce a child by mutual sexual interaction after the death of King Dilipa. Ruth further explains that Bhagas means Valvas and Bhagirathi means born out of two Valvas. Ruth also gives reference to Agni, who is not only born of two mothers but is nourished by the group of mother. So lesbian motherhood is a pertinent theme both in Tirohit and also though it is an English work. But very interesting, another interesting work is Sarupa Mukherjee's Across the Mystic Shore, written in English. Now I'm concluding. So, apart from the issues raised in these literary works for young scholars working in the area of queer regional literature, other areas of interest could be QDS, queer data studies, queer geography, queer animal critical studies, intersection of evolutionary sciences and queer lives, and medico-juridical gaze on queer lives. And new sources of subaltern knowledge can be produced. In the end, I would like to conclude with the words of Lani K. Ahumanu that portrays the queer dilemma beautifully in the poem entitled That Naked Place. To quote, I'm a free-ranging chicken. Don't fence me in. I can cook a doodle do your do and lay with the best of your hands. I'm a crisscross hop scratching. I'm a sexual politic free to follow the geography of my desire. I'm a human politic craving out new language in a time when there are no bad answers. Unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kuhu Chanana ma'am, for your insightful and thought-provoking lecture. Your, your perspectives have added great depth to our understanding of queer writing and Indian literature. We are truly grateful for your time and valuable contribution. Thank you so much, Kuhu Sharma ma'am. Now, we would like to open the floor for questions. If any of the participants have queries or reflections, you are most welcome to share them. Anyone? Okay. So, first and foremost, we are deeply grateful to our respected Vice Chancellor. Okay, ma'am, I think someone has queries
sure.
or any. Okay. Jayante Rana, can you please ask? Jayante Rana. I think. Okay, ma'am. So we are continuing. We are deeply grateful to our respected Vice Chancellor, Professor Nandini Sahu, ma'am, for her constant encouragement and support. Thank you very much, ma'am. I also extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speakers, Professor R. Raj Rao, sir. Thank you for your insightful lecture and for sharing your vast experience in queer studies and literature. Your perspectives have given us much to reflect upon. A special word of thanks to Professor Kuhu Sharma ma'am for her thought-provoking lecture on feminism, queer writings, and Indian literature. Your scholarship and clarity of thought have truly enriched today's dialogue. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
My sincere thanks also go to our faculty members, research scholars, and students who joined us. A warm appreciation is also to our technical team for their smooth coordination and behind-the-scenes support, which ensured the flawless conduct of today's event. Finally, on behalf of the organizing committee, I thank each and every one of you for your valuable presence and contribution. We look forward to organizing more such meaningful academic engagements in the future. So thank you all once again. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.